Hello everybody. Welcome to this morning's Speakers for Schools virtual talk. We're delighted you've been able to join us today. This session will last around 45 minutes and will include a presentation from our speaker before moving to student Q&A. Questions can be submitted via the Q&A function on the right-hand side of your screen, and this will be open towards the end of the speaker's talk. Unfortunately, we will not be able to answer all submitted questions. We anticipate several hundred being submitted and there's simply not enough time to answer them all, but rest assured we have received them. We're excited to welcome Andy Haldane, Chief Economist with the Bank of England, this morning. Andy's agreed to join us to discuss the importance of economics in everyday life, current affairs, and the link to link economics to your everyday lives. Andy's also very welcome to answering your questions about his own career path and background. Andy, hi, welcome to your first virtual Speakers for Schools talk. I know you've done a lot of these events for us in person, but this is the first time we're on screen.
It is. Morning, Carly. Morning, everyone. It is weird, isn't it? Weird for all of us. As you said, I've done lots of Speakers for Schools over the years. It was the first one I've done virtually from my house. So the dog might well make an appearance later on. It's also the first time I've ever done a Speakers for Schools without wearing a tie. You see, no tie today, which is very unusual for someone from the Bank of England. So yeah, I'm feeling moderately relaxed, at least at the moment, Carly. Shall I just keep going for a bit?
Absolutely, and then we'll get some questions for you ready.
I'll witter on about the economy and economics and what an economist means, and then we'll get some Q&A. You can ask me almost anything about those things, or indeed anything else. Let me start with the economy, which sounds a bit remote, right? Sounds a bit academic, but what I hope to convince you all of is that it isn't. It's about all of our lives, and it really matters. Never more so, in fact, just at the moment. Let's take the news this week. What's been in the news this week? Well, we've had news from Upper Crust, the shop that makes sandwiches. We've had news from Café Rouge, the restaurant. We've had news from John Lewis, the apartment store. We've had news from Airbus that produces planes, and in each and every one of those cases that news has been about jobs being lost by each of those firms. Probably 20,000 jobs lost just during the course of this week, and that's 20,000 families whose lives will have been affected by those losses of job. And if we look over the course of this whole year, you know, forecasts that we make at the Bank of England suggest that, you know, we started the year with about 1 million people, a little bit more, who didn't have a job. By the end of the year, we might be looking at, you know, perhaps as many as 3 million people who haven't got a job, for whom the economy is not working for them and is not working for their family. That's why it matters. And it begs the question, why? So why has that happened? Well, of course, you all know the reason for that, and that has been COVID and the lockdown response to COVID. What that has meant is that, you know, many of us, including me, you know, aren't travelling to work anymore. We aren't popping into Upper Crust to buy a sandwich for lunch, and that's one of the reasons why Upper Crust felt that they needed to lay some people off, because there wasn't as much demand for their stuff as there was at the start of the year. Very few of us are travelling very much, whether by train or by bus or by plane. And of course, because air travel has fallen through the floor as a result of the lockdown, that's the reason why there isn't the demand for planes, and why Airbus has had to lay some people off from its business. We are not going to the shops anything like as much as we were at the start of the year. That shopping we're doing is tending to be online rather than on the high street. And that, of course, is why John Lewis made some people redundant earlier this week, because the demand for their goods wasn't as high as it was at the start of the year. And last but by no means least, none of us have been to a restaurant for several months. We can start again on Super Saturday tomorrow, but that also has had a big hit on pubs, on bars, on restaurants, and that's why Café Rouge and others felt that they too needed to let some of their workers go. So what we're living through right now is a big hit to our economy. The way that's showing up, though, is in people having fewer jobs, and in people having lower incomes, and in people spending less. Now, if you watch the news, as I'm sure some of you do from time to time, been lots of stuff recently about COVID, obviously, but also about the impact that COVID is having on the economy. And you may have seen this funny concept, this funny word, this funny acronym called GDP appearing occasionally in the news. People saying, GDP is falling, GDP is contracting, we are in recession. So what's all that about? Well, I wouldn't worry remotely about the words or even what they stand for. So GDP stands for gross domestic product, but who cares? No one's any the wiser when you say that. What does that mean, really? Well, the guts of it are, it's about jobs and income. So imagine you're in your classroom, virtual classroom these days. Imagine that was your economy. If you're all in jobs, if you added up the incomes from you all being in your jobs, that's GDP. That's all it is, right? And that means that GDP can go up either if more of you are working or if you're earning more from working. So roughly speaking, GDP, when you hear it on the news, is all about jobs and income. The larger the number of jobs, the higher GDP. The larger your incomes, the larger GDP. So basically, the higher is GDP, the more incomes, the more jobs, and the more we have to spend, and the better off the economy. That's all it's about, really. It's a simple way of keeping score on how well the economy is doing. It's about jobs and incomes. And right now, of course, because jobs are going south, not north, and because incomes are going south, not north, this funny concept called GDP is, guess what, going south, not north. And it's going south at quite a rate of knots. As best we can tell, relative to January, the start of the year, this funny thing called GDP, jobs and incomes, is about a quarter less, or was in April, than it was at the start of the year. And that is a big hit. That's a big hit to people's incomes. It's a big hit to people's capacity to spend. And that's basically what we mean when we talk about recessions. Those are periods when this funny thing called GDP isn't going up, it is going down. And recently, it's been going down at a pace, at a scale that we haven't really seen in this country, or indeed in any other country across the planet, for at least 300 years, right? That's how unusual the early part of this year has been for the fortunes of our economy. Extraordinary times. And in response to that we've seen governments right across the world and central banks, such as the Bank of England, where I work, they're both doing extraordinary things to try and keep people in jobs, incomes growing, and therefore this funny thing called GDP recovering from that 25% fall I mentioned earlier on. Let me put in some context just how unusual a quarter, a 25% fall in GDP is. Let's look over the arc of the last 300 years. What has GDP, jobs and incomes, done over that 300-year period? Let me show you. We'll try to draw you a picture on this. Let's see if this works. Haven't done this before, so we'll find out. Carly, you can see that? Lily, you can see that? That's good. So this is me drawing the path of this funny thing called GDP, jobs and income, over the last 300 years. Obviously, slightly made up. You know, this isn't drawn to scale. So before that, about 1750. Before that, this funny thing called GDP had flatlined for ages. It hadn't gone anywhere, right? So incomes and jobs hadn't been growing for like thousands of years, weirdly. And then around 1750, they started growing and growing and growing. Little interruptions now and again, little bits, you know, recessions, mini recessions now and again, but gradually speaking, until now. And then that's happened, right? Weird, really weird. You see that? Is that just about seeable? So basically that is the history, economic history of the UK of 300 years on one rather rubbish picture. And the reason I mention that is because for most of that period, we've all been getting better off. Our incomes have been growing. GDP's been rising. On average, it's risen over the last 300 years about 2%. Now, 2% doesn't sound like anything to write home about, does it? 2%. What does that mean? It means if at £100 of income this year, I'd only have £102 the year after. It's not exactly chocks away. But actually, one of the beauties of compound interest, right, which Einstein said was the 8th wonder of the world, is that even 2% cumulatively over time really adds up. In fact, what it's added up to is that every generation has been roughly a third better off in income terms than their predecessors, right? That means that you watching this are going to be about a third better off than your parents, who were in turn a third better off than your grandparents, who were in turn a third better off than your great-grandparents, etc. You've got the idea. What that means is since 1750, roughly, we're all, 15, 20 times better off than our distant ancestors way back then. And why 1750? For those of you studying history, that was roughly when the Industrial Revolution kicked off in the UK. So nothing happened for yonks, and then all hell broke loose. And the reason for that was the Industrial Revolution, because that ushered in loads of really sparky innovation, right? And it also ushered in much better skills, so universal education. So if you ask me the reason, how come nothing happened for millennia and then it all kicked off? The answer is innovation on the one hand and education on the other. So that's something quite close, of course, to all of our hearts, and nothing could be more important for getting us back on the road than some sparky innovation and some good education. So this is the history of the world over several millennia in one line, and just puts into context how odd, how unusual this situation is right now, with this funny GDP thing having collapsed, let's call it that's collapsed, and with the number of people without a job picking up to perhaps around 3 million people. That's a roughly 1 in 10 of the workforce. Now, the last time unemployment was 3 million people was back in the early 1980s. In fact, so old am I that at that stage I was about your age, right? And I was growing up in the north of England, in Yorkshire. So I was born in Sunderland, which is up in the northeast of England, on a council estate, and then I grew up in Yorkshire, went to the local comprehensive school, early 1980s, in the north of England. And at that point, the number of people without jobs was back up at 3 million people. More than 3 million people weren't in work. And let me tell you, it was absolutely rubbish, absolutely rubbish. I was lucky. You know, my parents did have a job, but lots of my friends at school, their parents didn't have a job. And that was rubbish for their family, and it was rubbish for my community as well. That was a real cost. You know, not just that people didn't have money, but they were depressed. They're depressed about not having a job. It was, we call it depression for a reason, right? It's partly about the financial bit, but it's as much about the psychological bit. It gets under people's skin. And that unemployment problem back then became generational. Many people found it really, really hard to get back on to the jobs ladder. And that affected not just their family, but it affected their kids' ability to find work as well. Well, there I was growing up in Yorkshire, experiencing this in my town, on my doorstep. But it was that that inspired my interest in the economy, asking myself two basic questions. One, why that happened? How could that be? How could it be so many people didn't have a job? That was question one. The second question was, what can be done to make it better, right? So those are the two reasons where I thought I'd best try and answer those or think about those. So I started studying economics at A level. Then, you know, there's no history of my family of anyone studying economics. You know, none of my family had been to university. None of my family indeed had stayed on at school beyond the age of 16. But I lucked out because, you know, it was there on my doorstep, and I had this amazing teacher, Mr. Bates, who brought all this to life and made it for real and explained why this stuff was so important, explained how it might have happened, and explained what might be done to make it better. And that was the reason I then went on to study economics at university. And that was the reason I ended up applying for a job at the Bank of England, which, as best as I could tell, which is not very well at all at the time, was trying to answer the two questions I'd been asking myself when I was 12, 13, 14 years old. What's going on in the economy, and how do we make it better? And I can tell you, many years on, 35 years on, revealing my age, desperate. When I get out of bed every morning, those are still the same two questions I ask myself. What's going on in the economy? What's happening to jobs? What's happening to incomes? And what can I do? What can we at the Bank of England do to help make things better? So I haven't answered those questions, despite trying for ages and ages and ages. They remain the question I ask myself every day, and they remain the two reasons why I get out of bed every morning to do what I do. So let me say a little bit to end, and then we'll get the Q&A about just what do I do, which is a good question. one I haven't yet found a decent answer to, even though I'm asked on a daily basis by my own children. They think my job's a procession of meetings and make no sense of that. And maybe it is difficult to make sense of that. Well, one of the things I do at the Bank of England, the Bank of England is a variety of things. We are the biggest manufacturer of a good in the country. The biggest manufacturing company. The thing we manufacture, you may have come across this, although it's been less used. Is this come across these things? You've seen these? It's a real one, by the way. We manufacture those. That's one of the things we do for a living. And even though people are using these things a bit less at the moment, there's still plenty of them around. We do that. The other thing we do, and a big part of my job, is to set interest rates in the economy. We have a committee for doing that called the Mantri Policy Committee, and I sit on that. We meet every 6 weeks. We sit down, we look at over all the data on the economy. Is it going well? Is it going badly? And then we set the level of interest rates in the economy in a way that hopefully creates jobs and incomes, and therefore boosts GDP, and also keeps the cost of living, another funny concept called inflation, at its target level. So here's a tip, by the way. We have a target level for the cost of living, the rate of inflation, and that is 2%. And I mentioned earlier on that over the course of the last 300 years, growth in this other funny concept called GDP was 2%. So here's a tip. Don't let anyone else in on this tip. But the answer to all questions in economics are 2%, right? So if ever you are asked, just guess 2%, you'll almost always be right. So keep that to yourself. That's our secret. So I set interest rates, and at the moment interest rates are really, really, really low, pretty much zero. So we've done more to support the economy by basically printing loads more money, but not this money, not this money, not the kind of the physical foldy stuff that these days is polymer rather than paper. We print loads more electronic money, like digital money, and we've been printing loads of it, right? Loads, absolutely loads. By the time end of this year, we'll have printed 750 billion. So that's 12 zeros. Imagine that, 12 zeros, £750 billion of electronic money to also support the economy, which is whopper, absolutely gigantic. So let me finish off. What have I done this week? Give you an idea. Obviously, I've been sat here, locked down for 3 months in the house with the dogs and the kids. What's this week brought? Well, on Monday, how many of you watched the Great British Bake Off? Probably some of you. Lily's nodding, Carly's nodding. So on Monday, I interviewed Prue Leith, who's on the judge on the Great British Bake Off for a Bank of England webinar. Because one of the things I do is I run a series of interviews, discussions with people from all different walks of life, different professions, not just bankers and economists like me, but people with proper jobs, with interesting things. So on Monday, I interviewed Prue Leith about her whole life, which is amazing. She's been a businesswoman and an entrepreneur and a philanthropist, as well as obviously being a chef and restaurateur too. So that was Monday, and she was fantastic. She was on like this. She had her 2 dogs either side, 2 spaniels either side. And then on Tuesday, I gave a webinar speech on the economy. I spoke about this. Didn't use this diagram. I spoke mostly about this bit here, the end bit, and I was asking myself the question: what happens next? What letter of the alphabet will next describe the next bit? So the last few months, we've seen this pick up like this, right? It's sort of bounced back since April. And I said, so far, so V. If you're drawing letters of the alphabet, which one have we got so far? So far, so V. That was my punchline. And that promptly appeared in all the newspapers the next day, indeed still is. So I may yet live to regret that statement, but so far, so V. That was on Tuesday. On Wednesday, I had a board meeting for a charity that I'm vice chair of called National Numeracy. And they do what their name says on the tin. They're about improving the numeracy of the nation. Numbers, really, really important. Any of you out there thinking, I've not got a maths brain? You have. Everyone's got a maths brain. Everyone's got a maths brain. And it's really important that we all get comfortable with numbers, not really complex stuff, not fancy pants maths, just basic stuff, because it really helps us on things like, let's take my day job, interest rates. It's really important you all know about what interest rates are and whether when they go up or go down, whether that's good news or bad news. So, you know, it's not about Pythagoras' theorem, it's about the everyday use of numbers, and that's what that charity that I vice chair is all about. Yesterday, I was talking about digital currencies, right? So I mentioned this thing. This is not a digital currency. This is a physical currency. But maybe in future, all money or most money might be digital rather than just a bit of it. Maybe you'll all have a bank account at the Bank of England in future. Who knows? Anyway, that was a set of issues I discussed yesterday. And today I am doing this, of course. So that's almost certainly my 20 minutes up, Carly. So rather than wittering on about the rest of my week, why don't I stop there and see and take some questions from you about what you want to hear about.
Absolutely. We've had nearly 200 questions submitted, Andy, in the last 10 minutes or so. So we've got a lot of questions to try to get through in the next 15 minutes. Right. So first off, we have a series of questions that are really relating to your own career and your own journey. And one of our students has asked, what university did you go to?
Yeah, so I went to, I grew up in Yorkshire. This is also small admission, so don't let this go any further than the people on this webinar, right? So I went to Sheffield University, and there were two reasons for that, neither of which were especially worthy, to be honest. I'd like to say I looked across all the universities, decided which one was best suited to me personality-wise, which one did great economics, and chose that, but that's not the way it worked. The way it worked was that great teacher I mentioned, Mr. Bates, Peter Bates, he went to Sheffield University. When I asked him, he said, I went to Sheffield. So I said, fine, why don't I go to Sheffield as well? And the second reason that worked for me was at the time, you know, I can't pretend I was as diligent a student as some. In fact, I spent most of my time playing cricket at the time in Yorkshire. And it just so happened that Sheffield was commutable back to my home every weekend to play cricket. So I'd like to give a really kind of solidly academic answer to that question about why I went to Sheffield. But the truth is it was a combination of luck and proximity. And at the time, my somewhat greater love for economics, for cricket than for studying. Those are the reasons. I had a fantastic time there, brilliant university city, and still is, and still go back and other people there very well at the university. I went on after that to do some further study in economics, Warwick University in the Midlands, and then went on straight to the Bank of England, where I've been there now for, yikes, 30 years. So that was my so basically 2 Redbrook universities, comprehensive school, 2 Redbrook universities, and that was unusual. At the time, I was the first crop of Bank of England graduate entrants that basically didn't go to Oxford or Cambridge. So I got really lucky. They just started to take in people from a somewhat wider pool of universities. So I got lucky on that, and the rest is history.
Excellent, thank you. And Chelsea has asked, what about economics interests you the most?
Yeah, well, I mean, things that initially held my interest and still held my interest is the way that an economy that doesn't function well can affect really badly lots of people's lives. You know, that was the thing that kind of drew me in, and that's the thing that's held me in to the subject, that it really matters to absolutely everyone. And more than that, we can do things that make it better for absolutely everyone. You don't have to tolerate 3 million people unemployed. You can do stuff that makes things better for loads and loads and loads of people. The subject itself is sometimes billed as being, it's often called, has been called the dismal science. And I kind of understand why that might be, because it can sound a bit sort of arid, a bit dry. You're talking about numbers all the time, or talking about these funny concepts like GDP and inflation. But actually, it's mostly about stories, and it's all about people. So yeah, a chunk of my job does involve, you know, we've got hundreds of economists at the Bank of England, and they are poring over absolutely every piece of data under the sun, right? Trying to make sense of it. It's like a massive Sudoku puzzle, except that, you know, it's sort of million by million dimension Sudoku puzzle, and the data occupies the cells of the Sudoku puzzle, and we're trying to solve it. But it's not just that, because at least as much of my job is about speaking to people, speaking to businesses, speaking to charities, speaking to faith groups, speaking to local authorities, speaking to everyday citizens, to try and get their sense of how the economy is doing. It's about the conversation, not the numbers. They provide the colour. They provide my story about how the economy is doing. So we've had a big push at the bank over the last several years now to not only speak to businesses, but to speak to absolutely everyone across the whole economy. And that's why I do Speakers for Schools, right? You know, partly I hope, you know, you might learn a little bit from what I say. But let me tell you, I learn much more from you than you're ever going to learn from me. The reason I know that is because you are the economy every bit as much as I am the economy. And I can find out things about the economy, therefore, by having conversations from you. You might think that you're listening to me, but in actual fact, what's going on is that I'm listening to you, including through the questions that you ask. And that's a crucial part of it. You know, the economics, the economy sounds arid, can sound dry. Ultimately, it's about people doing stuff, and that's what makes it really interesting for me.
Fantastic, thank you. I hope that answered your question, Chelsea. And Gabriel has asked, if you could have all the money in the world but could only spend it on one thing, what would you spend it on?
Oh, wow. So that is a very good question.
All the money in the world?
All the money in the world.
Well, let me answer that, and then let me make a comment about it as well. If I was buying one thing, what would it be? I think I would pay to go on a long holiday that followed the England cricket team around, somewhere nice like the West Indies or Australia or India or somewhere. So I know that wouldn't take all the money in the world, but you know, that'd be a decent start. Of course, that's not going to happen now, is it? But anyway, that's why it's a hypothetical question to which I provided a hypothetical answer. The point I was going to make at the same time, though, is that I really don't want to give anyone the impression that it's all about money. The economy is all about money. Of course, it matters. It matters that people have got enough money. And that's why when people don't have enough money or don't have enough work, it's really rubbish. We should do something about it. But it really isn't all about money. I mean, let's just take the last few months. I mentioned that the economy has fallen off with my excellent diagram. But actually, and that was largely caused by the lockdown coming in, right? But you ask people, are you in favour of the lockdown? Despite it having cost a lot of money and a lot of jobs, a lot of income, and most people, the vast majority of people say, yes, we completely support the lockdown. A number of reasons for that, but a really important one is that they were valuing things other than money. They were valuing their own health. And in fact, they were doing more than that. They were valuing the general public's health. By us all individually locking down, we could improve, reduce the risk not just to ourselves, but to everyone else as well. We all pull together. I make that point because it demonstrates a very important general point, which is it's not all about money. It's about a wider sense of happiness, of well-being. The best paying job that you each could get is almost certainly not the one that will make you happiest. You know, the job I do, I'm reasonably well paid for what I do, but that's not the reason I do it. The reason I've stuck in what is basically public service is because I see myself as a public servant. And it doesn't matter that I could probably earn quite a bit more money if I went to do something else in the private sector. Now, other people, that's great. If that's what inspires them, if that's what makes them happy, that's absolutely what they should do. I think for most of us, jobs aren't just about that. They're about a sense of enjoyment, about a sense of purpose. Otherwise, why would you get out of bed every morning? So I think money, a certain amount of money is really important, but let's not overrate what money can buy you. And beyond the minimum level, it certainly can't buy you happiness. There's this thing called, let me draw another diagram. Just get my board eraser here, which is a piece of kitchen roll. So if you look at, so up here, so along here, I'm going to put this thing called GDP along the horizontal axis, right? Running left to right. So going up here, if you see that, that's GDP going up. And on the vertical axis, I'm going to put happiness. We measure happiness across countries, right? And what you find, if you look at countries over time, they tend to get richer, as in the UK over the last 100 years. And when you start at very low levels of income, of GDP, you get quite a lot of extra happiness from a bit more GDP. And that keeps on rising and keeps on rising, keeps on rising. But then it hits a plateau. That once you reach a certain level of income, whether you're an individual or an economy, a whole country, you don't really get any more happiness gains. In fact, there's some evidence that this line might even begin to bend down. Why might that be? Because other stuff matters more. You know, for example, if your bigger economy is a very dirty economy, you know, it's very polluted, it's destroying the environment, that makes you quite unhappy. if you live in a big city, like I do in London, have to commute in, that makes you quite unhappy. Biggest benefit, to my happiness at the start of the year is not having to commute for 2 hours every day. I didn't used to work from home really, and didn't realize how much I used to hate commuting, but now I do. So yes, a certain amount of money is really important. Jobs are important, incomes are important, but they aren't all that are important. And the last 3 or 4 months has really demonstrated that. Think of all the value that was created by us speaking to our neighbours, helping our communities, us volunteering for the NHS. That doesn't appear in measures of this funny thing called GDP. Does it make us happy? Does it make our lives better? Absolutely, it does.
Thank you, Andy. That's fantastic. We've had a lot of questions from students around how they can prepare for a career in economics. So I know Amy, Naomi, Emmanuel have all asked questions around this, as well as some other students. So I guess, do you have any tips for young people on how to be successful within a job that involves economics, or what are there any kind of specific skills that you think are required to be successful?
Yeah, so I think the skills that are useful for becoming an economist, if any of you should want to do that, I mean, the core ingredients are no different than any other profession, actually, of which the most important is having an interest and passion about it. I think if you have that, it's really easy. And if you don't have that, it's really difficult. So, I often mention about my maths journey. People often think economics is a very mathematical subject. You need to be super strong at mathsy stuff to do economics well. And to an extent, that's true. It's certainly helpful to have some mathematical skills, some technical skills. As it turns out, I didn't do A-level maths. That was almost certainly a mistake, but I didn't. Ended up doing, teaching myself maths a few years later, one extremely miserable summer. But what matters much more is that I'm interested in what the economy was doing, and interested in what people were doing and saying. And I think that is true of whatever job you do and whatever subject you end up studying. People listening to this talk this morning, I hope this maybe still there. You're going to be working, this is not to put you off, by the way, but just kind of brace yourself for this bit. You're going to on average be living 100-year lives, which is brilliant. Here's the less brilliant bit. Probably going to be working 60 or 70-year careers, which is quite a long time, but I mentioned that, not to put you all off or to depress you before your summer holidays start, although it might, but to say that it's therefore really important that what you do, one is something that gives you purpose, that gives you happiness, gives you a sense of contributing, whatever that is, that you're passionate about, if you like. But also, you'll probably end up changing not just job, but career 2, 3, 4 times over the course of your 60, 70-year career span. And that's really important too. That, I think looking ahead, if I could sort of speculate, do a bit of sort of Mystic Meg type futurology about the future, sort of knowledge in the traditional sense, knowing things about facts of various types, will matter much less, and a more general set of characteristics or learnings will matter much more. So, for example, creativity. The reason you'll be able to kind of toggle between different careers, not jobs, careers, is if you have creative mindset. If you can apply your mind, apply your hands and your mind to different sets of problems, different jobs, different careers at different times, and to approach that in a creative way. And that's going to be crucial. Social skills, the capacity to listen, to have a conversation, to strike up relationships, to show sympathy and empathy, to negotiate, to lead, to manage. Those social skills in future are going to be even more important than they are today. So those for me are going to be the really, really important parts. Whatever the profession ends up being, whatever the label is, those things are going to be super important in future, and they speak to not boxing ourselves in too tightly to be an economist, an engineer, whatever it might be.
Fantastic, thank you so much. We've slightly run over, but we have time for one last question, I think. And this is, we've had a few students submitting questions around this, and they are, what are your favourite books on economics currently? And are there any books you would recommend to 16 to 18-year-olds?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I'm just looking around my office for which ones I would particularly recommend at the moment. So let me recommend, actually, the book I'm going to recommend, which flows exactly from my previous answer, is not by an economist. It's up on my bedside table because I'm reading it just at the moment. It's by an evolutionary biologist, I think called Edward Wilson, and the topic is creativity. And that's the book I am reading, and which I'd encourage you all to, I don't know the precise title, but creativity is in it. Maybe the origin of creativity, that might be it. And it's a book about the evolution of our species, but it's also a book about the evolution of our economies. Because the one feature that we as humans have that no other animal on the planet has is creativity. By which I mean, we all have the ability to imagine a completely different future, and then crucially, to set about creating that different future. That's why every animal on the planet is pretty much identical to what it was 1 million years ago, except humans. And the reason humans, remember that chart I showed you, the upwards path of GDP? The reason we've been able to do that as humans, in a way that no other animal has, is down to creativity. We can imagine a different future and then set about creating that imagined future. And that's true of our societies, it's true of our economies, but it's also true of each and every one of you as individuals. That you can imagine a different future for yourself. Sky's the limit. And then crucially, you too can set about creating it. 35 years ago, when I was growing up in a very working class family in Yorkshire with no history in any of my family of doing what I'm doing now, I imagined a somewhat different future, one where I was working on the economy, trying to make it better. And through loads of good luck and a good chunk of hard work, I've helped make that imagined future real. If I can do that from my background, absolutely, so can each and every one of you.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much for being with us this morning, Andy. Unfortunately, that is all we have time for. We have slightly run over by 5 minutes or so. But a huge thank you for joining us today and for such a wonderful insight into your work, the role of the economy in our society, and also for answering our student questions. We did have about 250 submitted in the end, so we were never going to be able to get through them all. But thank you so much for submitting your questions, and we will be sure to share them with Andy afterwards so you can see some of the things that were on your minds as well. Hope that's okay with you, Andy.
That'd be great. I mean, as I say, I stand to learn more from this than you do, and the questions will will help me on that learning. So absolutely, yes, Carly.
Fantastic, thank you so much. Just a quick announcement for our students. Feedback form has been shared in the Q&A thread. It'd be fantastic if you could complete that. And if you've been asked by your school or college to complete the student activity sheet, the colour for today's talk is jasmine. Andy, thank you once again for making the time to be with us this morning. I can only imagine how busy you must be at the moment, but it's been an absolutely delightful morning, and I really think our students will be walking away from this with a great understanding and appreciation of the economy, and also some thoughts about their own futures and careers as well.
Thanks, Carly. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your morning and your summer holidays.
Absolutely. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.